It's the Devy Digest powered by League Winners. I'm Andy, and we're talking 2024 rookie wide receivers. I have a special guest today. We cover all this and more after the intro. What is going on, everyone? I am joined today, had to bring him back on, Noah Green. What's going on, Noah?
Andy, how are you, man? It's a pleasure to
Good.
be back, as always. I'm doing great.
Glad to have you aboard. Now, so we had to bring you back today. We have a big show today. We're just going to get right into it. We're going to talk about the 2024 wide receiver class. It's a deep class, it's a large class. There's a good 13 to 15 names that are in top 10s. So, are you ready for your top 10 receivers and a couple of wild cards and a dark horse today?
Let's do it. Let's get
All
into
right.
it.
So,
So
who
just for context, I want to share. Everyone who's listening to this show is active in fantasy. If you're listening to the show, you're active in fantasy football. You're likely on Twitter, potentially Reddit, other social media sources where everybody right now is in the process of putting out rankings, right? Everybody is putting out their top 10 rankings, their top 12 rankings, their sleepers. People are getting into college tape. NFL analysts are getting into college tape for the first time. You are saturated with information. So I want to contextualize when I am doing rankings, my rankings do not equal value. Number one, there is no way right now to say what value these players are going to have. We do not have draft capital yet. And I usually actually, even if I'm doing NFL rankings, like my own rankings do not always equal value, what I think is the perceived value of those players. So I want to make clear when I'm sharing my rankings that these are the rankings, these are how I rank these players, and I'll explain why I rank them where I do. But I just wanted to contextualize that a little bit because we see a lot of these rankings, and when people put them out, I ask a lot. I'm like, what do you mean by rankings? Is this how you personally evaluate these players? Is this where you think their value is going to be? It's how do you actually? So I just wanted to clarify. I am not stating I think this will be how these players are valued at the end. It's more this is how I see these players as prospects at this moment in time. And we were talking before the show a little bit too about this, where this is a kind of a fun time to do this show because it is pre-Senior Bowl, and the Senior Bowl in the past couple of years has had an enormous impact on draft stock. And guys that have been very unexpected have come into the Senior Bowl that nobody was talking about and have just risen their draft stock tremendously. Guys like Josh Palmer, Michael Wilson. I could continue to go on. There are Jaden Reed was there last year. Like there are a lot of players who have gone into that game and made a really big impact and gotten themselves. So a lot of what I'm saying right now is sort of projection, and these things are fluid and certainly can change. But these are my rankings. This is how I see these prospects in a very, very deep and interestingly tiered class. So I'm kind of excited to get into it, but I just kind of wanted to start with a little context for listeners of how I actually think about this process. And I'm not fail safe. I'm not perfect. I'm not per se a film guy or an analytics guy. I know football. I look for indicators that lead to success and predictive success and sort of retroactive analysis of what factors make guys successful. So that's how I'm thinking about this, and it's going to be really fun to get into it. That's what makes this game fun to play. But I wanted to start with that context just because there's so much information on this right now out there.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. And like a lot of people, when they do make rankings, they don't really know how they're ranking it. Some are doing
Right.
because they will start with saying, well, Marvin Harrison's the number one prospect. He's the
Right.
best one, so he's number one. And then
Right.
number two, they'll go, it should be this guy because I think this guy is going to be
Right.
really good. And then number
Right.
three is like, I think it'll be this guy because a lot of people have him there. So it's like it's just a
Right.
whole mixture of things. So like yeah, there's it's good to have a context and why you're ranking and how you're ranking. A lot of people
Yeah,
need
exactly.
need to know that. And then but the most important thing besides the rankings is tiers. I think
100%.
tier-based drafting is the way to go because you can really get a lot of value that way. Like you have tier one, tier two, tier three. That way, when your draft is coming up, if there's three guys that are in the same tier, and if they're in the same tier for you, you should move down if you're able to and get one of those
Yes.
guys and pick up assets. But as far as
Yeah.
the Super Bowl goes, I do agree. That the whole tagline, the draft starts at Mobile. It's true.
It does. Yeah, and it is more and more as college football is moving into this NIL era where more and more guys are going back to school. Um, More and more guys are transferring, are getting extra years of eligibility, and are looking for that place to showcase it. And you look at the Senior Bowl receivers this year, and you could see, I mean, you could see 6 to 8 of the wide receivers in the Senior Bowl going in the second and third rounds right now. And some guys that I might not, I'll probably mention off the cuff, but aren't in my top 10. And just like that is going to happen for sure. So I'm comfortable with that. That's okay. This isn't sort of it's always nice when you sort of can put out, oh, I'm really into this one sleeper. Like, I'm not looking at this that way. I see strategy. I think strategy trumps player evals. I think for exactly the reason you said, if you can think about things in tiers and be not a little bit less picky and understand your odds at different areas of hit rates, then you can have a huge advantage. So I'm absolutely approaching this from a strategy perspective, and my choices in some ways were strategic to kind of explain the factors that I'm looking at to see whether I think a guy can be successful at the next level. Um, and that's kind of I made some strategic selections in some ways for that with guys I really do like, and also guys that I think hit some markers that are worth talking about. That can lead to success at the next level. It's a
Yeah,
hard and wide receiver's hard to predict. Like it is hard. It's not running back is easier to predict than wide receiver historically. Wide receiver is easier than quarterback and tight end, but it's not. Look, NFL teams struggle with this. We see it every year. Guys get drafted in the first and don't pan out. This is not because those scouts are terrible and stupid and awful. It's that this is actually hard, and that like that it's really tough to do, and sometimes it's a mixture of a lot of things sometimes that allows a guy to hit. So picking those, I like to look at, here's a group of guys that I think are interesting in a tier, and here's why certain factors of one of them might separate. That's how I kind of approach the exercise.
perfect. All right, let's get right into the list. Who's your first guy you want to talk about?
My number one receiver is Marvin Harrison Jr. And has been and will continue to be. He's interesting. So another thing that I think about a lot when I think about wide receivers is what type of wide receiver are they? Tim Alb has a great framework for this that he put out last year, and I'm sure he's probably going to do it again this year, where he kind of clusters wide receivers into types and share. The thing is, no matter what type you are, you can succeed in the NFL. It's not that types are definitive and are sort of either harbingers of doom or uh, guaranteed markers of success, but there are some archetypes that have an historical higher likelihood of succeeding in that model. It's an interesting model and worth checking out. It's on the Campus to Canton website. Marvin Harrison Jr. isn't necessarily the type of receiver. He's not the modern NFL receiver archetype that we see a lot of today necessarily. That doesn't matter to me. He is such an elite prospect. He's 6'4", 205. It's his name gives it away that he is Marvin Harrison's son, one of the greatest receivers in NFL history. That matters. Interesting, he was not a 5-star recruit. He was a 4-star recruit, and he was highly ranked for sure, but he was not in the like top 5 kind of. He wasn't in that elite group of receivers from the recruiting services, and he took a long time as a freshman to come out. He did hit the year 1-0 thresholds as a freshman, but really not. I think he did it in the bowl game. Like it was very late it was like very late in the year, and he was at risk of not doing it.
Yeah.
And then his sophomore year just went absolutely nuclear. You can see it on the screen, 77 receptions, 1,263 yards, 16.4 yards per catch, 14 touchdowns. The thing with Marvin Harrison Jr. is he's big. He's incredibly fast. He's an incredibly good separator. He's very capable after the catch. He's got a really broad route tree, and I think his route tree there's room for his route tree to keep growing. You watch him, and he doesn't move like a guy who's 6'4". It's an absolute joy to watch, and I think he's like how will he measure at 6'4"? He might measure at 6'3", but he's going to be at least in the high 6'2s in that range. And if he's 6'3" at this size speed ratio and this game ratio, it's I think he's just an incredibly talented receiver, and there just aren't a lot of players like him. So I think that the hype is well deserved. He's obviously been doing it at Ohio State against the highest level of competition right from the beginning. And again, even that freshman year, keep in mind that 2021 freshman year was Jackson Smith-Njigba, Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave. Like this was not him. The fact, like, he had to wait till the bowl game largely because those guys were there, and then they got out of contention. So, when we look at why did he not break out as a freshman, if that's a knock on his profile, I don't see it as a knock given the context, because those are 3 of the top, 15 consensus dynasty wide receivers in the NFL right now that he was dealing with. So it's not like it's not like I don't think that. I just don't see that as a knock for him. So he's easily my number one, and the bloodlines matter to me. Like the bloodlines are real. Like that is a big deal, and I think it just increases the likelihood that he's incredibly successful. He's likely to be a top 5 draft pick, and go to a team that needs he is a really true outside traditional kind of one receiver. And again, it's not. I think there's room for him to diversify his game for sure. Although he has been a bit of a sort of he's been more of a deep threat than an intermediate threat in college. I think he can be a really good intermediate threat and even a short threat. He's really good with contested catches as well. Although I think that metric is super overrated, so I don't want to get too far into it. But he's very capable at the catch point. He's got it all. And that we don't see a lot of receivers like him coming out that have it put together the way that he does. There are very few holes in his game.
Yeah, and I think it's a real good argument to make that he could go 101 even in superflex drafts.
Yeah.
And as soon as he gets selected, he's already a tier 1 wide receiver in Dynasty with, CeeDee Lamb, with Justin Jefferson, with Jamar Chase. He's already
Amon-Ra
there.
St. Brown. He's in that Puka. He's in that top 5, 6, 7. Like Marvin Harrison versus Puka is an interesting conversation to have. And it's a tough one to choose. I think the way I feel about Harrison as a prospect is my brain tells me that I should take Puka because of what he's shown this year. That's what my brain tells me. Harrison is an elite enough prospect, like you said, where and Caleb Williams is an elite QB prospect. So the fact that we're talking about him as a legitimate, like if somebody drafted him 101 overall, I'm not saying I would, but if somebody did it, it speaks to how great of a prospect he is.
Yeah. I think the only issue that, and I wouldn't really say it's an issue, but the only thing that I have regarding to him is I don't know, like coming in, him creating after the catch while he's able to do it, that's not his strong suit. But is
Yep.
it more of a point where Kyle McCord couldn't hit him in stride to get him to do that? Because we did see those long passes where he would finish it for a touchdown. So we do know he's got that ability there. It is more of, I want people to be aware that he isn't a superstar all around. He does have some holes where, you know, it might be some questions there, but at the end of the day, he's a tier one wide receiver. It's just
Yeah.
you just have to know that coming in, his creativity after the catch, it is something that he will have to work on slash improve on.
Yeah, I think so. Although, look, he averaged 6.4 yards after catch per catch this past year. Um, so it's not like he doesn't have that ability at all. 6.4 is a solid, like that's a solid, that's not a bad, and if anytime you're over 6 yards after catch per reception, especially at 67 receptions, so I agree it's not a strong suit, but I don't think it's something like you said that he can't do. I think it's just I think there's room for him to grow in that area, and I think he can grow in that area. But it's a good point. It's worth noting. And again, that's kind of the thing of like the not modern day, like we think of these modern day receivers, we think of these guys that are catching it in space, making guys miss, etc. Is he doing all of that? Let's take a look. He did have where is it here? Yeah, he's not a big like force miss tackles kind of guy. That's just not been his strong suit. But again, like you said, I'm not holding that against him. It's just a place where I think he could get a little better.
Yeah. So I do think he is the consensus 101 for the wide
Yeah.
receivers. Who's the next receiver you want to talk about?
I want to talk about Malik Neighbors. He's my number two receiver in this class, and I think pretty consensus number two, not universal, but pretty consensus number two. Um, Neighbors was a 4-star recruit, went to LSU, and had a really solid freshman year in 2021, and then in 2022, everyone was expecting the entire community was expecting Kayshon Boutte to continue the ascension that he was showing over the course of the 2021 year and become that next kind of Jamar Chase. We love to helmet scout, right? So it's like, yeah, the next Jamar Chase is going to be Kayshon Boutte. And then Malik Neighbors just took over and went for 72 receptions, 1,017 yards, 14.1 yards per catch as a true sophomore in the SEC. It's important to say, like, that was not the passing offense that you saw this year in 2022. And Jaden Daniels was not the passer that he was this year in 2022. He grew a great deal as a passer and changed a great deal. And that's something that really is important to note, is that that 72 for over 1,000 is impressive in the context of the offense, because it wasn't a high-powered passing offense at that point. It just wasn't. This was a big explosion and change this year from the way they ran in previous years. And this past year, he went, I used the word earlier, he went nuclear. 89 catches, 1,569 yards, 17.6 per catch, 14 TDs. The thing with Neighbors is his overall profile, when you look at everything about Malik Neighbors, it's relatively hard to find a hole. He's got one of the strongest analytic profiles that you're going to see anywhere. Um, Marvin Harrison Jr. has a very good analytic profile. Also, in some analytics nicks could argue that Neighbors analytics are even a little bit better. Um, and he's incredibly well rounded. So the thing with Neighbors is this year he was almost 50% out wide, 50% in the slot, caught the ball literally everywhere, all three phases of the field. Almost 7 yards after catch per reception. He just showed the ability to separate in so many different ways. When you look at him, as people are getting into his tape, one of the things that I see repeated a lot, which I noticed about him over the course of the year, especially, and even last year looking at him, was like his acceleration is really like he's not, I don't know what he's going to run as a 40, but he's one of those guys that kind of goes 0 to 60 like in a blink of an eye, and his game speed is really really good. He's very good. He's good at the catch point. Um gets open again. If you will see every type of catch made by Neighbors, my guess is that his reception perception profile will be off the chart. Like he will have a lot of green in his profile because he ran a very extensive route tree and had success at all the levels against really top competition. So he's there pretty firmly as my wide receiver too. And when you talk about tiers, I've actually got Harrison sort of in his own tier, and then Neighbors in his own tier, and the two of them and then also the two of them in a sort of big tier above the other receivers in the class. The knock you'll hear on Neighbors is that he is sort of is what is the thing he's elite at. That's the knock you'll hear. Like we know Marvin Harrison Jr. is elite as a long ball threat, as a size speed combo nightmare. Like we know the things he does, and he does other things at an elite level, but he's got like a really clear elite kind of skill set that like that's what like you look at Jamar Chase, like that's what Jamar Chase had. Like that's the type of player he was. Neighbors is a different type of player, and again has played everywhere. It will be interesting to see how he gets used in the NFL. Will he be more? I could see him being more of a slot guy. That's not a negative at all. We see a lot, like we were talking pre-show. CeeDee Lamb has a very high slot percentage. Amon-Ra St. Brown has a very high slot. Like that is not a negative at all. He is the type of receiver I look for. But that's the one knock you'll hear. I don't think he's a really really elite wide receiver prospect. He would have been easily the wide receiver one in this past class, and I think he's as a prospect, he's on the level of any of the wide receivers from the previous year. Like I think as a prospect, you put him up with and or above the Garrett Wilsons, Chris Olaves, Drake London, like that kind of like he's a really elite prospect.
Yeah, with Neighbors, a lot of people do view him not having that one trait to stand on as a negative. But for me, I view that as a positive because
Yeah,
he is not scheme or team dependent. He can
yeah,
literally land in any one of 32 teams and he will
yeah,
be able to play right away because he is so well versed, does everything so
yeah,
well. I remember when I did my Devy Digest piece on him this past summer, my only concern that I had with him is red zone. If he
yeah.
would be physical and alpha enough and have strong enough hands to get touchdowns in the red zone, and he answered that in
Oh
space
my
this
God,
year.
did he ever? Did he ever? 14 touchdowns later. And I love what you said because that goes back to the 2022 year where LSU was running, like Jaden Daniels was, for NFL comparisons, imagine sort of a young Justin Fields, like he was a dual threat running first quarterback, and Neighbors was able to thrive as a receiver in that offense, despite it not being a high powered passing offense. And then as it made the leap this year, Neighbors made a leap, and it'll be interesting. It will be interesting to look back and think when we look at this LSU passing offense, how much of it was Daniels, how much of it was Neighbors and Thomas, who we'll talk about later, and those receivers. I think the answer is probably both, and those debates aren't really useful. But it's one of those things where you're right. Like, I think he is a guy you can put basically anywhere, and he is going to find a way to succeed, and he has done it all the way. He's put it on tape and in the box score and in the analytics room. Like, he is all the major key analytics. He's really, really elite. And just the yards per route, like the yards per route run with the number of routes he ran this year, like absolutely unbelievable. Of all the sort of Power 5 guys, he's got the highest career receiving yards per team pass attempt. He's got the highest career EPA per team pass attempt. Like, all of those metrics that dominator rating, like all of those metrics that dominator rating is not number one, but he's pretty high up there. The freshman year kind of took him down a little bit, I think. But if you look at his career numbers, but this year it was incredible. Like, he was the highest this year. It was he separated himself. So he's got a lot going for him, and I'm very in on Malik Neighbors at the next level.
And then for managers, if you have the 102 and you are good at quarterback, I would definitely trade down to 104, and
Yeah.
you can get Neighbors at 104, and you don't have to reach up to draft him at 102 if you like him. So for me, I do think, Marvin Harrison, like you said, is in his tier of his own. He's a tier 0 guy for me. Neighbors is that tier 1, and then there was a big drop to tier 2.
Yep.
So I do like the top 2. Who's the next guy you want to talk about?
So the next guy I want to talk about is Xavier Worthy. And this is higher than consensus on Xavier Worthy, and so I'll share a little bit about why. Xavier Worthy is 6'1", 172, so tall and lean, which is an interesting combo. I think he's got potentially room to add some more, a little bit more muscle, but I don't want to add too much because. So Xavier Worthy, first of all, elite prospect, ranked anywhere from as high as wide receiver 2, as low as wide receiver 13 in his class. Came into Texas as a true freshman. I will say that again, as a true freshman at Texas, and put up 62 receptions for 981 yards at 15.8 yards per catch with 12 touchdowns. I cannot put into context how impressive that is and what a big deal that is in the world of thinking about college football, Devy. Like, it is so rare that a prospect comes into a top program like that as a true freshman against top-notch Power 5 competition and puts up a season like that. And it can't go away. Like, the analogy to use is, in order to do that, it requires, like, it's like the term virtuoso, right? Like, you think about going back to, like, even like composers, right? Like Mozart as a young child was like running circles around people much older than him at the piano. What that indicates is an innate skill set that is incredibly elite, that you can come in against that absolute top-notch competition and put up a season like that. Like, people talked about Drake London being a freshman breakout at USC and how impressive it was. And Worthy's numbers dwarf Drake London's USC freshman. Like, it was such an impressive freshman year. And it means something. It means something about the level, the type of talent that he is, the ability he has to get open. So Xavier Worthy's trait, his elite trait is speed, for sure. Worthy is that sort of next level speed. He's got that. When I say next level, I'm talking like Deshaun Jackson type speed. He's got that. You watch him and he just explodes past guys. He does it in the punt return game. He does it in the receiving game. The thing that happened with Worthy is that his sophomore year, he regressed a bit. one of the big concerns about him in the sophomore year was the hands. The thing is, it's come out since the season was over. Xavier Worthy had a hand injury during his sophomore year. He also had a really rocky quarterback situation. So Quinn Ewers started the year as quarterback, got injured against Alabama. Then they were playing. I'm gonna get the random. It was Hudson. Was it Hudson Card? Is that who it was?
I believe
One of,
so.
yeah, like one of those ran like then went to Purdue or something. It's like Hudson Card or Haynes King or one of those guys came in. So he had subpar kind of QB play and rocky QB play. Plus, he was injured. So people talk about the hands. Like I went and looked this up. Just pretty simple. So his freshman year, he had a 4.6% drop rate. His sophomore year, he had a 10.6% drop rate, and his junior year, he had a 6.3% drop rate. Like, I am not a person who thinks that he has a hands problem. I also think that drops are overrated. It's coming out more and more. Like, you look at the drops leaders in the NFL this year, and you see like Puka, CD, ARSB. Like, you see the guy. Like, when you get a bunch of targets, you're gonna get drops. Worthy has never, in 3 years at Texas, he has never had below 60 receptions. His bad season was 60 receptions for 760 yards and 9 TDs. That was his bad season. Like I cannot. I think that Worthy getting dinged down. I think is almost a case of did he like peak too high too early that what people expected was so excessive that there was no way he could ever meet it. And then you get something like an injury and QB issues, and you can all of a sudden fall off the radar. This past year, he went 75 for 1,014, 13.5 a catch, 5 TDs. After that freshman year, you and I have talked about this. He was used very differently, and that's because of his quarterback. Worthy can be an elite separator and deep threat in the NFL, as evidenced by what he did his freshman year, and as evidenced by a multitude of examples littered all over his tape where he just breaks guys deep. He did not have a QB who could throw it deep to him. He just didn't. Like he did not have Jaden Daniels like Malik Neighbors did, who was throwing really, really great deep balls. He just didn't have that. We've talked about that. If you watch, you can see him getting underthrown a lot. They started to use him more in the short passing game. They started to you saw usually wide receivers in college, the typical path is in their early years, you'll see a high percentage of screen passes as their overall percentage of receptions. And then it goes down as they diversify their game and come in. It's almost like you get a freak athlete who's less refined as a freshman, and what you want to do is get the ball in his hands and get him to move. Worthy is like the opposite. And a lot of that had to do with what the offense looked like and how it worked. And so I think he's going to get pushed down a little bit. I don't understand why. I think he's an elite prospect. He is, there's a chunk of guys in this class that have hit multiple of the big analytic markers, yards per team pass attempt, dominator rating, EPA per team pass attempt that have peaked the top 24 threshold for likelihood to reach a top 24 season in the NFL. Worthy's one of the guys that has hit that multiple times across the metrics. I'm just not willing. He's my number 3. He's so fast. He's so elusive. His skill set is so unique. I think landing spot will affect his value a great deal. I will be interested in him regardless, but I think that his landing spot will impact value a lot because you can imagine some places where if you take this skill set and if he goes to a Buffalo, like if he goes with a Josh Allen, if he goes to a Kansas City, if he goes to if he goes to the Chargers somehow and falls to the second, goes to the Chargers and gets a Herbert, his value could all of a sudden people are going to be like, oh, this guy is like next level fast. We've talked about Neighbors, Harrison Jr. being fast. Worthy is so he's my number 3.
Yeah, I do agree with that. And With Xavier Worthy, he's a very nuanced route runner that people
He
don't
is.
give him credit for. People want to say he's a lazy route runner. He's just a vertical guy, but he's
Yeah,
not really. You
he's
have
not.
to actually watch the tape and watch him play. And like you were saying, he Texas had to essentially neuter their offense this year because of Quinn Ewers.
Literally.
There's so many times Xavier Worthy was used for like short screens and he would take it to the house. The prime example is against Wyoming. Texas was struggling. I want to say it was a one possession game
It
still
was.
towards the end of the first half, and then they did a little bubble screen to Worthy, and he took it to the house, and that's because of Queen Ewers. And so many people want to say, he's not this elite prospect, this and that. But if two or three of those deep passes, if they would have connected, the whole entire profile Worthy would be different. So I do agree with that. He is my wide receiver three. He's been my wide receiver three. My only worry about him is he ends up being that Hollywood Brown type at
Yeah,
the next level.
yeah.
That's my only concern.
Yeah, yeah, or the most recent, like the Jamison Williams. Does he, from a fantasy perspective, does he become? Is he a sort of field stretching kind of guy who doesn't have as much fantasy impact? Is a question one could have. I just look at it and I'm like, he has produced. Like he isn't a guy who didn't produce. Jameson Williams had one season of elite production. Hollywood Brown did not produce. Like those guys did not produce the way that Worthy did. And like you said, I just looked it up. He had a 10.3 ADOT this year. If you have Xavier Worthy on your team and he has a 10.3 ADOT, you're not using him right. Like that is just indicative of that's not how he is. So he gets in the right, like he's really interesting. But I agree, that's the one kind of concern. But it's a risk I'm willing to take. There's enough in his profile that projects really, really well to the next level.
And then as we do take a look at, the rest of the receiving group, once you get past the top two, all these receivers, they have really
Yeah,
unique skill sets and traits, and they all have some unique cons. So it's not like,
they do.
oh, Xavier Worthy at three and he has these kind of negative traits. How is he number three? No, the entire class has negative traits.
That's right. And every year that's true. Like there is never a year that isn't true. And we want to just put a projection, a comp name on these guys and throw it in. Like all prospects are raw and take time, and they take time to develop, and all these things matter. So, that's why drafting is a risk. For sure. So I totally agree with that. And I will, well, let's go to the next guy, but then I'll kind of talk about the tier concept, like you said, because again, I do have a tier break before Worthy, Neighbors and Worthy. I don't have a tier. I have Worthy and I have Troy Franklin in a tier with Xavier Worthy, who's my wide receiver for this class. Um, Troy Franklin is 6'3", 187 as of right now, at least. He'll probably measure in a little shorter than 6'3" also, but like again, he's gonna be around the 6'2" range. Again, both Worthy and Franklin are 20 years old. I want to state, like they are early breakouts, early declares. They fit that model. They are top recruits, early breakouts, early declares. I'm not. That is not a Bible, but it is an it is a it is a it has a very positive historical impact on your odds of success at the next level. So Troy Franklin came in like Worthy. He was in the same class as Worthy. He was ranked between wide receiver 3 and 9. So the two of them were both in that absolute elite tier of receivers in their recruiting class from California. As a freshman, 18 for 209 with 2 touchdowns, which is maybe doesn't seem like a breakout, but at a program like Oregon hasn't played a freshman receiver in a few years now. I mean, it's not that easy again to walk into the Pac-12 and do that as a true freshman. And he smashed the year 1-0 targets quite easily. And then what Franklin has done is simply ascend and grow his game every single year. So when you look at it statistically, when you look at it analytically, when you look at it in terms of sort of his production metrics, he has improved his game. He has diversified his game. He has answered, I think, a lot of questions about his game. And I think he should be considered an elite prospect going into the NFL draft. Franklin shares Worthy's elite speed. Franklin is a field stretcher and a game breaker. You can watch him ripping souls out and just taking slants to the house, beating guys over the top with double moves. I've been really impressed with how he has refined his route running over the years. He entered much more raw than Worthy did. Worthy entered like again to do what he did as a freshman. Like he entered with a level of refinement at route running that we don't see very often. Franklin has just gotten better in that area as he's gone along. He is this past year, he 81 receptions, 1383, 17.1 per catch, 14 touchdowns. Just absolutely took the next step to being the question about Troy Franklin coming into this year was like, could he be a number one receiver in a big time program on a big time team? You can't say he didn't answer that question with a resounding yes. It's impossible to look at, like, you can nitpick it if you want, but like the fact is he did. He answered that question. Can he be at the next level? I don't know. I don't know if he's going to be a number one receiver at the next level. And his game is interesting. He's interesting, and I find him a little challenging to project as far as some of these receivers go. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that, actually. But the tools he's just got these elite tools. He's got elite separating. He's got elite speed. He also has a very diverse route tree, actually. Lines up inside, lines up outside, is versatile. It can beat guys. You can see him beating guys in a lot of different ways. But I'm interested to hear, like, what are your thoughts on him in terms of projecting?
Well, with him, what I like about him, he's a very high IQ guy.
Yeah,
I think his IQ and his speed is what he hangs his hat on. He has multiple gears of speed, and what I like about
yeah,
him is he'll slow play a corner, and then all of a sudden he'll just blow right by him. So he views the corner as pretty much like that cat and mouse game, and he will just bide his time, play him, and then with his high football IQ, he'll just trick the corner. So I really do like that. My comp for him has always been a lankier Brandon Cooks. Both guys just find ways to win.
interesting, Tom.
They
Yeah,
use their speed to get open and separate and just find ways to do that. My
yeah,
only negative traits about him is physical corners do give
yeah,
him a tough
yeah.
time. And then was he a byproduct of the system? Because that system is
Sure.
predicated on space. So is he someone that's going to need to go to the right opportunity? Like if he were to end up in a more enclosed type of that environment where he has to be that traditional wide receiver on the outside, will he find success? I don't know. So I do think his landing spot matters.
I couldn't agree more. And the Brandon Cooks stylistic that's a really good, just like, again, thinking not a comp, but like thinking about it the way we talked about earlier in terms of clustering a wide receiver style type. And he's much taller. So it's, he's got a lot more height. So he's a really interesting one. And again, I agree with you. I think landing spot could have impact on how I think about him, but it's just hard for me not to have him here. I can't have him not here because of all of the markers stated of his prospect profile that just indicate there is a trajectory and likelihood that he's going to find success at the next level, and be able to hit. And when I say find success, I'm meaning the likelihood that he has at least a top 24 season or multiple top 24 seasons as a wide receiver in the NFL, which means he's
Yeah.
an impact player. And will he be a wide receiver one? I'm not 100% certain he will. I think a lot of that depends on scheme, like you said. Could he be a wide receiver three? Could he fall into a Gabe Davis type of yes, in theory he could, but like that's okay for, like, I'm okay with that. Like that's a risk you can take with the tools that he brings and the IQ that he brings.
I keep wavering Xavier Worthy, Troy Franklin, and Roma Dunze. I keep wavering
Yeah,
them at 3, 4, and 5.
yeah,
Like one day I'll have Xavier Worthy
yeah,
3. The next day I'll have Franklin at 3. The next day I'll have Roma Dunze at 3. Those three are so interchangeable for me that until I know what the landing spot is, I'm willing to trade down and get whoever's
yeah,
left of the
yeah.
three.
That's right. And I think the fact is that like Roma Dunze is number 5, so we can like leap right there. And the fact is Roma Dunze is likely to be the wide receiver 3 in most draft classes. So me putting and to be clear, me putting him at 5 is not saying I don't like Roma Dunze. I'm not out on Roma Dunze at all. I like Roma Dunze a lot. He has grown on me a great deal over the year. And the more that I've watched him and the more that I've looked into what he's done, I think he's incredibly talented. Like I wanted to contextualize that because I think people react and say, "Oh, like you're low." It's like, no, you Worthy and Franklin are you are talking about two very high level elite prospects, and it is hard to rank these three guys. Like, and Roma is also a very good, very very good wide receiver prospect with a potential of being. He's got a ceiling of a wide receiver 1 in the NFL. Like he has a ceiling of putting up at least one wide receiver 1 season in the NFL easily. Um, and the question is sort of what's the range of outcomes for him? So Roma Dunze, uh, listed 6'3", 216. Again, I bet that is all these numbers, as we learn every year, are slightly inflated, but he's a big bodied receiver for sure. Um, Odunze did not have the early success that the guys that Worthy and Franklin did going into Washington. It should be noted that 2020 Pac-12 played a shortened season where they only played 5 games. So you could it's one of the places like even Austin Nace will say like if I was ever going to make an exception for year 1-0, it would be for Pac-12 players in 2020 because of the COVID shortened season because they just didn't have as many opportunities. And Adunze had 6 receptions for 72 yards in those 5 games, so it wasn't like he didn't get on the field. So I think that's take that with for what it is. Improved as a sophomore, 41 for 415, and then junior year really hit it, 75 for 1145, and then this past year obviously went absolutely nuclear production wise. 92 catches, 1640 yards, 17.8 yards per catch, 13 touchdowns. The thing with Adunze for me, so Adunze, I'll be interested to see how he tests. He's a guy where testing is going to actually matter, especially because of his size. Um, like I think like Worthy and Franklin, I feel more confident that they're going to run incredibly fast 40s and they are likely to have pretty good short drill time. Like I think they're actually likely to have pretty good like cone drill times as well because they're very shifty in space and very natural fluid movers. I could be wrong. That's just my take. Adunze, I have some. I'm gonna be interested in his testing a lot because I think that will have an impact with his size, especially. Um, I've had questions. I had questions going into this year about his separation abilities. He answered some of those this year. Like he did improve as a separator this year. He is known as a contested catch maestro. I think he had a 70% contested catch ratio this year, and he is very good at that. I point out that I don't love high percentages of contested catches in my wide receivers. Like that isn't the archetype of receiver I am looking for. So coming into this year, especially like the fact that he had a high percentage of contested targets, and then I'm like, it's great that you caught them, but I don't like that they're contested because it suggests to me a separation question. So that was a question. He did show some of that to me. He doesn't, to me, always look as fluid as Worthy and Franklin do, as some of the other guys we've talked about do as a route runner. It's not that he can't run routes. He isn't a bad route runner at all. He's a good route runner. But like I've heard him compared to a bigger Olave, and I don't. The place I see that is he's kind of a he's a little bit of a go deep, not as much of a yak guy. Again, he's not bad. He's not bad after the catch. He just isn't. It is he's kind of been known as this deep ball guy. I guess I could do it on that way. I don't think he's the separator that Olave is, and I don't think he's the fluid mover and route runner that Olave is personally. That's my kind of concern about him. But again, this is a high level prospect that I am saying it is very hard. He is absolutely in this tier with these two guys. And I, like you, I kind of go back and forth. Odunze is very likely to have the highest draft capital of all of them. And so his value will likely be highest. It's just, I have had some concerns and I have the system question for him too. So over the course of this episode, I'm going to hit the other two Washington wide receivers a little later. And one of the questions I want to ask with this Washington wide receiver class is how will we look at it? Because this class, Rome Odunze, Jalen Polk, and Jalen McMillan, is as loaded, arguably, as one of those could be looked back at as one of those historically loaded wide receiver rooms, or it could be looked back at as this was an incredibly efficient offense. That some of the questions you raised about Franklin, I have the same questions a little bit about the Washington receivers, which is again why it's hard to rank them a little bit, those two guys, because the systems they're in are they have some similarities there.
I think with Rome, for me, he's a little bit stiff at the hips,
Yes.
and all these people that post on Twitter, all these highlights that he has are all vertical routes. And I
Yeah.
don't have any questions about that. I think at
No.
the next level, he will need to be used as a vertical receiver, post corners and flies. He is not going to be someone that's going to be asked and be successful at digs and outs, because the separation, any separation that he creates when he has to bend his hips, he's going to lose that separation to the corners at the next level because he is a little bit on the stiff side. People don't want to admit that. People don't want to think about that. But
Right.
that is facts about Rome Odunze. While he is a track athlete and his straight line speed is good, I think he'll test fine just because of
Yeah.
how his history is. I want to know if he's on a test at the combine or at the pro
Mm,
day.
good
That's
question.
my thing, because
Yeah.
we all know at these school pro days they soup it up. They have it kind of downhill a little bit, so everything's a little bit faster
Yep.
for you. So I want to see if he's going to test at the NFL Combine, or if he's just going to measure in, weigh in, and say I'm just gonna bide my time when my pro day's at. That's my only thing.
Yeah, I agree. But again, landing spot, and he couldn't get better at these things. Like this is where these guys are as a prospect. This is not. I don't want to speak for you, Andy, but it's certainly not me sitting here saying Roma Dunze can't get better at those things. Like the prospect you just described, a little bit stiff hipped, go routes, all of that, big, fast track athlete coming out. Who does that sound like? Could say that sounds like
DK.
Mike Evans. Mike Evans, DK, right? And those guys have grown their games and found other ways to get open. And so, and Rome seems to be a very hard work. Like, this is not a question of that. It's just prospect level wise, I have him here. It's in the tier, but it's not, he's not like, oh, it's like, I've seen it where there's a tier, there's Rome is wide receiver 3, and then that's the tier. That is not how I see it. I see it as Rome is part of this tier with Worthy and Franklin, and he isn't, the gap between the next tier is very close for me. Like the next two guys that are coming after, because I do think there's a pretty clear top 7 to me. With if Rome is 5, and the 6 and 7 are closer to Rome than this tier was to Neighbors for me.
Who's the next guy you want to talk about?
Brian Thomas Jr. from LSU, 6'4", 205. Again, it'll come in a little less than that, but he's a big, tall, fast wide receiver. 21 years old, former 4-star recruit. Came in 2021, and like Neighbors, got some really nice play as a freshman. 28 for 359 with 2 touchdowns. Again, these are great numbers for freshmen to be putting up, for kids to be putting up as true freshmen in the SEC. Like great numbers. His sophomore year, he didn't quite take the leap. Like, you look at, Franklin, for example, and Neighbors, like Franklin jumped up to, I want to say 40, 50 catches. Neighbors jumped up to like, he didn't jump up that high. 31 for 360, 111.65. So he kind of fell off the radar a little bit, and fell down, although he was actually originally a higher ranked recruit than Neighbors even was. But he fell down a little bit after that sophomore year. Junior year, 68, 1177, 17.3, and 17. Now he's getting a ton of buzz right now. And I want to say I love Brian Thomas Jr. I think the buzz is getting potentially a little bit. The buzz is getting more than I am willing to buy into, because I really like him, but I do think that he has a lot of work to do to grow his game. He is tall and fast. Like I think he will run. I think he will run incredibly. I think he will run a really good time when he's timed, and his field speed is incredible. His ability to separate deep is incredible. He does show really good physicality, actually, which is kind of cool to see, and has more to offer in terms of after catch than I think he gets credit for sometimes. I don't think he always gets credit for how good after the catch he is. And I think his physicality is going to be an interesting one to see. I think he can be physical. I want to see a little more of it, but there's enough in his tape of him being physical. You can see it in the blocking game, and you can see it in after receptions where he is willing to just put his head down and get in there. And I really love to see that for him. And he was, look, I mean, he helped make that LSU offense, Jaden Daniels and Malik Neighbors seasons possible by offering this. When you have Neighbors, who's this, like we talked about, do it all, run every kind of route guy, and then you have a 6'4", 205 sort of gazelle on the outside who's just elite on the deep pass, but also has he's got the ability to run other routes. Like I think he's got the ability to have a more refined game, and I think there's a lot of room to grow for him, and he has shown improvement over the 3 years. And again, that sophomore year, just remember that offense was in, I know Neighbors had his breakout, but Thomas didn't like fall off the planet. Like he didn't have a huge regression. And when you're looking at college production, that's kind of how you want to look. And if you have these elite prospects that have a little regression, definitely ask why and see how big the regression really is. I don't think his was worth it. So he's here for me because of that. I think he's a potential dynamic guy. And again, where he goes is going to be really interesting to see.
He is such a weird profile for me because he has a really good release package, has really good lateral agility, that good short area burst. My
Yep.
thing is that he tracks the ball really well, but he doesn't high point it. That's just so confusing being a
Mm-hmm.
6'4" guy. And
I hear that.
then one thing that is also an issue is lengthy corners gives him issues. So
Yeah,
yeah,
they do.
it
And
goes back
physical,
to that
lengthy
physicality
physical
part.
corners. Yeah, lengthy physical corners can give him issues, and getting bumped at the line can give him issues. So again, he's again not a perfect profile, not a perfect prospect at all. He can have some issues with that.
He's kind of similar to the next guy you want to talk about, right?
He's very similar. So Adonai Mitchell is the next guy. I want to talk about another 6'4" receiver, 21 years old. Mitchell, another incredibly high 4-star recruit, went to Georgia 2021 and had a really good freshman year. And then his sophomore year, he got injured for almost the whole year. He did catch a touchdown in their like a crucial, actually an important touchdown in their in the national championship game. And he did in 2021 also, and he got this kind of reputation for big touchdown catches in big games. I really like Adonai Mitchell as a prospect. Then he went to Texas this year and had a relative breakout, not quite the level that Thomas did. Again, we should qualify that I think the offenses were different and the person throwing the ball was different. So Mitchell went 15 for 845 with 11 touchdowns. He's a big speed guy who with a high ADOT, really good deep target. You want to talk about high pointing the ball? Like you can see it in the picture. Like Adonai Mitchell high points the ball. This one was very this one is very hard for me to, and I almost like I consider them almost equivalent. And again, if somebody wants one of them and wants to offer me something extra to move back a spot and get the other, I will do it in a heartbeat. I've had Mitchell a little bit higher at many points in the year and might flop that. Like I could easily see myself flopping that back again tomorrow. So it's a really hard call for me. Mitchell's a really good red zone threat as well, like very, very good red zone threat. He will get knocked for his yak. I do not think he should get knocked for his yak because I think that he's got the athleticism to be able to create. And we have seen, like I was talking with you pre-show. I mean, people don't know, like Amon-Ra St. Brown, his last year at USC in college, had less than 4 yards after catch per reception. And he's considered one of the yak kings of the NFL right now. Like this does not, I think Adonai Mitchell, if you get him in an offense where he gets the ball in space, I think he can have the ability to create after the catch. So that's not concern. He runs a pretty diverse route tree. I I think he's potentially a more sophisticated route runner than Thomas even. I'm curious to know what you think about that.
Yeah,
I can't I go back and forth. I go back and forth a little bit with them, but like they're on the level at least.
yeah, I think Adonai is I think he's a more springy athlete. I like his stride a little bit more. He eats up the ground. He I I think he's a better route runner than Brian Thomas,
Yeah,
but he while watching him, he's also a weird profile because
he is.
he has really good footwork for his size, but he's not going to be someone that has little to no wasted movement in his route. So while I like his route running, it it at times can look a little bit awkward just because there's just so much movement there. So
Yeah,
it is a little weird to see, but I don't view it as him not being like that route running savant. He just
right.
has a lot of length to him. He's a very lanky athlete, a very springy type of athlete who's very twitchy and just that's just him. He just uses a lot of movements and it's awkward to look at, but it works.
Little Isaiah Pacheco in him,
Yeah, yeah, I can see
right? Like a
that. And
little bit of that, like just
yeah,
not the same, but like he does have that. Like you do see that look. It doesn't. It's not like it. He doesn't. It's not. It doesn't look effortless.
yeah. I think Brian Thomas at the next level, I think he could be used more as a chess piece than Adonai. I think Adonai, you just stick him to the outside, and that's who he is. Whereas with
Yeah,
Brian Thomas, you can move him into a big slot if you want to,
yeah,
and you're able to have a little bit more options and versatility with him. With Adonai, what is kind of frustrating when I view his profile and when I try to just like look at him as a whole is a lot of times he'll misjudge the ball in the air, so he doesn't really have that elite tracking, but he's such a good athlete that he'll just hang in the air for what seems like forever and it doesn't matter, and
yeah.
his athleticism makes up for that missed timing. So I think with coaching at the next level, I think he's the guy that will be better than Brian Thomas Jr. So for him, his landing spot is also dependent as well because of that.
Agreed. I would agree with that. I would agree with that wholeheartedly. And even if you look at their, um, even if you look at their sort of, yeah, you look at their. Actually, interestingly enough, if you look at their just overall lineup rates, like Mitchell lined up more in the slot than Thomas this past year,
Oh,
just
really?
by 5%, but he did line up a little more. So he might have some um he might have some potential to be a little more diverse. I would dig into that a little more. Again, these are the questions we're going to be digging into a lot. Like, there's a lot to dig into here, so it's a really interesting question.
And then on like a little side note here, we're both of us we're in this freshman mock for a C2C, and I'm on the clock. So
Oh,
I
heck
was
yeah.
making my pick as you were going, and
Who'd you
I picked
pick?
the guy. I picked Nikar. I just had to do it at
You picked
205.
Nye. I was
Yeah.
definitely going to take Nye if you didn't, but
So
I'll probably be up here in
you're
a few
you're on
minutes.
deck. You're
Yeah,
on
I'm on
deck at
deck. All right.
207.
I am on deck in the freshman mock. All right, that's good to know. When it
All
comes
right.
on
So
air, we'll pick it on air.
all right. So who's the next guy you want to talk about?
Keon Coleman. And again, I've got a tier break here. So Coleman's probably the most controversial draft prospect in this receiver class, I think I would say. And he's a guy I'm very torn on, and it's in some ways hard for me to have him here because I have some major concerns with his profile. Coleman was not he was not I think he was fluctuating between 3 and 4 star recruit, but he was not the elite recruit that this top 7 were. Went to Michigan State, did not break out as a freshman, broke out a bit as a sophomore and had a really good sophomore year, 58 for 798 and 7 touchdowns. That was by far and away his best season analytically, production wise, etc. He made his name in the draft when he transferred to Florida State this offseason. And where he made it, what he did was he blew up week 1 against LSU on primetime TV. And everybody saw him have probably the best game of his college career as they destroyed LSU. And Keon Coleman immediately, as a 6'4", 216 guy, just all of a sudden he was wide receiver 2 at that moment. Like he was wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3. Like Keon Coleman is this guy, etc. The thing is, it didn't stick. So Keon Coleman had a really up and down season this past year. And when I look at it overall, here are the things that concern me about Keon Coleman's season, especially at Florida State. Keon Coleman struggled to he struggled to separate. 40% of his targets this past season were on screens. We talked about the screens thing earlier and the general trajectory of it. For a 6'4", 216-pound guy, 40% of your targets coming on screens not as a freshman, like as a junior, where you should have suggests potentially to me, why was that happening? Was that part of just an intentional scheme? And I understand he's very athletic. So one of the things about Coleman is Coleman is very good in space with the ball. Watch him return punts, and you'll actually see he's actually got a lot of really good agility. He can make guys miss. He's very good in space. I don't see that in his route running, and I don't see that in his separation. So whether it was part of an overall scheme that held him back, or whether it was that they realized, because what I started to notice when I watched some Florida State games was, especially Johnny Wilson outproduced him all year. And I do not think Johnny Wilson is the same prospect as Keon Coleman. It makes sense that he would. He already had a connection with Travis. He was the returning guy. It's not totally surprising, but what concerned me a little bit was Wilson went out for a big chunk of the year, and Keon Coleman did not ascend into a wide receiver 1 role. So what you saw coming out about Coleman early in the year was this guy's an alpha. What does alpha mean? I think sometimes alpha means like a big outside X prototypical wide receiver. The way I would define alpha now is like, are you the number 1 target hog, target earner on an offense? And are you capable of being a number 1 target hog, target earner on an offense, whether you are 5'10" or 6'4" doesn't actually matter to me. And I don't think he's an alpha by that definition at all. He struggled to separate. So I looked at it, of his targets on the year. It looks like 33% of his targets were contested. That is an incredibly high number. If you take out the screens, if you take out the 40% screens, and then you recalculate it, 60% of his targets were contested. That is, I'm like, that is that is a struggle to separate. That is a struggle to get open and find ways to get open. He's considered a contested catch maestro, and he's got a bunch of George Pickens type one-handed catch highlights on tape. Um, that's I don't think he's bad at it, but his percentage isn't as good as it. Like he isn't winning a lot. He only won 33% of his contested catches this year, and he had a lot of them. I mean, he had a ton of contested catch opportunities and was only catching a third of them. So I see concerns in his profile. I have him here because I think unless something changes, he is likely to get very high draft capital. And I do see enough upside in his size, athleticism, speed, sort of combination that he has that he could take some steps and grow. Um, I don't know who to comp him to. Like, I have a hard time projecting him also. I saw somebody put up an Allen Robinson comp. I'm like, that is not what I don't see Allen Robinson. Like, that is not what I see. I might see more George Pickens, but see, I think Pickens was a much more refined route runner than Coleman was, and also I think better at contested catches. So Coleman, I think, is one of these guys that needs to he needs to do a lot of developing on his own. I want to kind of see actually like who he gets as much as his landing spot. I also want to see how does he grow and develop himself in the off season? How does he develop his route running? Because I just look at it and I think I watch him against these corners and he struggles to get open against not bad corners, but not always elite corners to me.
With him, I think he's one of those 2004 NFL wide receivers,
Yeah.
guys who can't separate, just toss it up and, he'll catch it. My I've been kind of toying around with this comp. Like the on Twitter, there's a guy, I think his handle is at Devy, and he's like well, anyways, he comped Roma Dunze to Keneal Harry. I
Oh,
think,
to N'Keal Harry.
yeah, so I think Keon Coleman
Yeah.
is actually N'Keal
Yeah.
Harry because
I
both
see that.
guys couldn't separate. Both
Yeah, I
guys
see that.
aren't uber athletic.
I
Both
see that.
guys relied on their
Yep.
length to win
Yep.
in
I
college.
see that.
So if you can't separate in college and you're not an uber athlete, how are you going to do that at the next level?
I
So
see
for
that.
me, I am super low on Keon Coleman,
Yeah, I see that.
and that N'Keal Harry, that's the comp that sticks for me
Yep.
for him.
Yep. Yeah, and that's the thing. And again, why do I have him here? Like, what I am also, I have these concerns. Like, I struggle to see Keon Coleman being a super successful NFL wide receiver. The reason I have him here is right now based on if he's going to get round one draft capital. Again, it's an odds game. Like this again improves your odds of likelihood to succeed. Like that is an important marker, whether we like to call it that or not. And when you're getting outside, I think there is that clear top seven in this wide receiver class. And once you get outside of it, like these next three picks and everyone I talk about after, it's not say I don't have tiers. The tiers are not defined yet, though. There are too many variables coming up that are going to be really important markers for how those tiers get defined. And so right now I've picked ones that I think are interesting darts and archetypes to look for. Like if he is big and really fast, if he runs a really fast 40, which I think he will, that improves his odds of succeeding in the NFL. Being over 6'2" and running a sub 4.4 40, I've seen a breakdown. Like that actually has a pretty it's not a guarantee at all, but your likelihood to succeed goes up. So I'm interested, but I see this in Kill. It's like I go back and forth, and that's why he's very separate. Like the teardrop is the biggest right now between the 7 and this tier, starting with Keon. That was the biggest tier cut, like the biggest gap of a tier of any of the tiers that I've laid out. That's how I see it. And so when I'm picking these next three guys, it's like 10 was a random number. Like you could have said 15 and I probably would have been comfortable basically fluidly moving within a tier of like 8 guys.
Now with Keon Coleman, going back to what you just said, would it be a bigger concern if he were to test well? Say he comes in at say he comes in at 6'2" and a half, 212 pounds. Say for that size, say he tests at a 4.5. Would it be a bigger concern that he can't separate having that size and adequate speed than if he were to run like a 4.59 being a true 6'4 guy?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Um,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, the closer he can get to, like, this is where, like, 40s, I don't typically think 40s matter, actually. Like, I think they're way overrated. We have seen them be incredibly overrated. So when I'm saying I want to see how these guys test, I don't just mean a 40. 40s do not determine things, although we do know the NFL cares about them. So, like, they do have an impact on. So if he runs even the gap you just said, a 4.5 versus a 4.59, could be a round difference in his draft capital. If he runs a 4.4, that's another round. Like, these can have big impacts. I think that metric gets overrated. I think if the faster he runs, unless he comes in under 6'2", like 6'2" is kind of the cutoff point for what you would call like that big, tall kind of wide receiver versus a that mid height kind of range. So I think as long as it's like 6'2" and a half to 6'4" makes less of a difference to me than a full second in a 40 does. And the closer he gets to 4.4, the better. And if he runs below a 4.4, you can just stamp the draft capital going up.
But
And that's where, yeah.
could you okay, if say he tests well, his three cone,
And
his
he might,
40,
because
all of that.
he is pretty
If
shifty. He might test well there.
if all that tests well and he can't separate, isn't that
That's
a bigger concern?
it is. In some ways,
Isn't he kind of like this year's Quentin Johnston then, if that's the
yeah,
case?
it is. That is how I see. I do see. I don't want to jump to that, but like that is what I see a bit. And Johnston ran a 4.5. He didn't run as fast as people thought he would run, and then he wasn't as tall as people thought he actually was. And it turns out he wasn't as good catching the ball. I think Coleman is better at the catch point than Johnson was. I do think that, like, he has things on tape that show me I do think he's got different kind of hands. I just see so much development, and yeah, it would make me. I see what you're asking. It would make me ask the question. I don't understand why you can't separate, because there's all of these. If all of these physical tools, if you are that shifty and that fast and this big, I don't actually. It's like, what is the gap here, and is that gap? How do you fix that? That's why I say it's the outside coaching thing. We've seen this come up in all these coaching interviews. Like, you see Shanahan talking about it, right? He's like, it's not. We call the plays. Like, we scheme the plays. The players develop themselves. My thing is, what is Keon Coleman's? How is he going to develop that ability? And yeah, that would raise in some ways a bigger question for me of, like, what is the issue here?
Yeah, I think he is probably the most polarizing. Well, probably the second most polarizing. Rome's the most polarizing because if he's not wide receiver two, you're just a troll.
You're a troll, correct?
One.
Yeah.
And then Keon Coleman's probably the next most polarizing guy.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. So there's that. All right.
So who's the next
Let's go to
guy?
all right. So I want to clear, like, 9 and 10. My goal here is to bring up two names that I think I don't see in a lot of top tens. I'm doing that deliberately. They are also guys that I love. And as I mentioned, I see a very big tier here. So I am not sitting here. My goal here is not to flag plant and find a clip later that these guys, it's to share an archetype that I like and that I think should be paid attention to for NFL success. So my next guy is Anais Smith from Texas A&M. Anais Smith does not fit the prototype of a lot of the receivers we talked about. He was a 3-star athlete as a recruit. He's 5'9", 200. So just measured in the Senior Bowl. So we know that is more accurate. I love the 200 pounds. I love the 5'9", 200. He's going to have an awesome BMI, and that's going to be really good. He's 22, played 5 years at Texas A&M. Here's the thing about Anaya Smith. This dude does everything. He is elite. He's an elite receiver. Well, elite is a strong word. Let me pull that back a minute. He started his career as a receiver, and then his sophomore year, he was basically forced into playing running back in 2020. And he had a great year. He had 49 carries for 300 yards at 6 yards per carry with 4 touchdowns as a true sophomore in the SEC, running the ball for Texas A&M. 2020, I don't know if anyone remembers, like Isaiah Spiller was on that team, and Anaya Smith smashed Isaiah Spiller in all rushing efficiency metrics. Like, he was such a better rusher than him. They moved him back outside, but like over his college career, he's had 72 carries for 405 yards at almost 6 yards a carry. That versatility is something I really, really value. He was pretty consistent as a sophomore and junior in terms of stayed in the 43 to 47 catch ratio, was in the mid 500s. That offense was not an electric passing offense at the time either, but he maintained some production and put up some TDs every year. Also really good in the return game. Was injured for most of 2022. Only played 4 games that year. And then this past year, he had 53 catches for 795 with 15 yards a catch, 2 TDs and some carries and work in the return game. My thing with Anaya Smith is he is really sophisticated route runner, and he is really good at separating in all phases of the game. I was looking, like, he's a type of guy you would think would be. So another thing about him, like, so when you're talking about missed forced tackles, which we've talked, like that yak stuff, that missed tackles forced, which by the way it's not a guarantee, but it is a positive indicator of some next level success. He was he ranked second in the SEC this year in missed tackles forced. Neighbors led with 30, and then he was actually tied with Luther Burden for second. And for anyone listening, Luther Burden is known as the missed tackles forced maestro of maestros. Anaya Smith makes guys miss. Like, he's a guy, if you get him the ball, he makes guys miss. He has the running back background. He is an effective and efficient runner. He can break tackles. He can make you miss in space. And it shows up in his route running too. He gets open in a variety of different ways. So like his ADOT this year was 10.4. I mentioned Worthy earlier, where I was like, if you have Worthy and his ADOT is 10.4, you're grossly misusing him. When I see Anaya Smith at 10.4 as an ADOT, I'm like, oh, like, here's a comparison. Like, you get a lot of Malachi Corley is the next slot yak wizard guy for the NFL. Malachi Corley's average depth of target was 5.5. He was 10.4. He is a more versatile receiver who also made more people miss than Malachi Corley this past year on fewer opportunities in much better competition. So he's the type of guy, look, guys who have had that rushing success in college and that versatility, to name just a couple, like off the top, your boy Puka was known. That was like, the Rams video has circulated of them talking about his versatility in the run game and how they could use him all those types of ways. McConkey is getting a lot of that buzz. I think the buzz is going to the wrong SEC receiver in terms of the guy they're picking to be the versatile one who has all the right. Like, I think Ladd is versatile, but he has like 5 or 7 rushing attempts in his whole college career. This guy has played full-time running back in the SEC and succeeded. You just don't see it that often. Debo, obviously, famously, is one of those guys who has gotten that. Though I'm not comparing him to Debo. I'm not saying he's that level. I'm saying he is a guy, if you are looking at a bunch of receivers, and he's going to have the Senior Bowl, I'm dying to see how he plays, because when you watch his tape, the guy gets open, the guy makes plays, the guy makes people miss. He does it a variety of ways. He's much more versatile than you think. You'll see him catching long balls. You'll see him catching short balls. And the 5'9", 200 is pretty, like, that's okay. I'm like, that is a threshold where we have seen that size profile have really good success at the next level. Um, and Smith has hit like early in his career, he's hit sort of dominator thresholds for top 24 seasons. So he's got that in his pedigree. And I'm a fan.
I think people that are hyping Lad, they they think Lad is the type of player that Anaya Smith is. I think
Yep.
that's the thing. They haven't seen Anaya Smith, so they want to project Lad to be this savant of doing all these things. But you already have someone in that class, and that's Anaya Smith.
Yeah, and he is like, and the thing with him that's interesting, like he lined up 25% outside, 75% in the slot. I actually think he isn't only a slot guy. I think, and keep in mind, he's played like he was injured last year. This year, Evan Stewart was on the field for most of the time, and they have a stack loaded wide receiver room. You're seeing there are a couple of these super breakout wide receivers coming out of college, but a bunch of them, as we're seeing with all of these profiles, there are a bunch of guys that are in very crowded wide receiver rooms that are producing somewhere in there. And some of those guys translate that success to the next level. And I think Smith is a guy who just had like he is so electric on the field. I think he'll test pretty well. I think he'll run a sub 4.5. I think he'll have a very good cone drill. Like I think he'll have like I think he'll test really well in those areas. And I think he could do a lot of work for himself at the Senior Bowl this week. Like he's the type of like in one-on-one matchups, I think he's gonna like this again, second most missed tackles forced in the SEC this past year. I think he's gonna have cornerbacks on skates this week. I could be wrong, but I think he's gonna have them on skates.
I Every year there's always a G5 guy that I root for because I do want these G5 guys to get drafted early. So Malachi Corley is a guy that I'm wishing and I'm wishful that he gets anno day 2 draft capital. But like in reality, what what people think Malachi Corley is this Anaya Smith kind of guy, but Malachi Corley is a very different kind of a player profile when you look at him. So there, every year I do have this G5 guy that I hype up and that I kind of hope gets that early draft capital. With Lad coming out, Anaya's coming out, it's harder to see Malachi Corley being the top slot guy getting picked. And
I
I
can't see
know
it.
yeah, and I know there are guys out there that view him as a top 3 slot guy, and at a certain point in time of the year, I was one of those because I really do root for these G5 guys because you at the end of the day, these power 4 guys, power 5 guys, they're supposed to be drafted this early. These
Yes,
G5 guys, you see their monster Uber production, you're just hopeful that they get to the next level. At the end of the day, if you want a slot type of receiver that can create, that can take carries, that can be the quote unquote next Debo type, it's not Malachi Corley, it's Anaya
it's
Smith.
Anaya Smith for sure. It is, I want Corley to succeed also. And there are things, but he did not break out. Like he didn't break out as a freshman at Western Kentucky. Anaya Smith put up more as a freshman at Texas A&M than in his first 2 years at Texas A&M. Anaya Smith produced more than Malachi Corley did at Western Kentucky. Then for 2 years, he put up these insane numbers, getting again 40% of his catches on screens. That just to me, and all the missed tackles forced, like the numbers he looks good in the open field. He's not competing in the SEC. He is not making SEC defenders miss. I want to see it. I want to see it at the Senior Bowl. He's got moves, he's got quickness. He may put guys on skates a little bit. If I had to bet on one of them, I'm going to bet on Anaya Smith for sure. And then again, I'm going to hope that Corley. I'm going to hope that Corley succeeds because I want him to succeed and I like him. I don't dislike him as a player. I don't dislike any of these players. We're not in here, this is not slander about these players. We have to figure out how to rank them and make decisions on them. And we're pulling the veil back on the rationale for it. And that's the rationale. Like the rationale is I don't see it. And I think Corley will go higher in drafts because he has more buzz. Although Smith could change that at the Senior Bowl if he really shows out, and it'll be a huge marker for him. It's an important for his draft stock. It's an important thing, but they're not far apart in mock draft. They're not that far apart in mock draft database, and certainly not far enough apart at this point in time that it can't be like closed. Like Anais Smith could work his way into the second round. There is an easy world in which that could happen with a strong Senior Bowl performance. Not saying it will. He could be a day 3 guy with some upside. If he's a day 3 guy, he's a type of day 3 guy I'm going to take with a little upside. Like he's one of those guys. He's one of those 3rd, 4th, 5th round players I want to take the flyer on because of this versatility. And like you said, I think he's the guy people are missing. Like he's the one who fits that profile the best to me, which is why I put him here.
Yeah. And who's the next guy you want to talk about?
And the last guy is maybe the most controversial. So I'm going to talk about Jermaine Burton from Alabama. 6 feet, 194 pounds listed. We'll see how that pans out. So Jermaine Burton was a Devy and C2C darling. He was a top 5 to 10 wide receiver in the 2020 class, depending on the service you're looking at. He came into Georgia immediately and put up, again, everyone on this top 10 list. The thing they share, with the exception of Keon, honestly, like the thing they all share, and Rome, but with the caveat, is they went in as freshmen to big conferences and put up like pretty solid numbers. And we talked about the Marvin Harrison Jr. one. Like the rest of them, that really does matter. He did that at Georgia. Stayed pretty consistent with his production as a sophomore. His freshman and sophomore years looked very close to the same, and then transferred to Alabama. And the expectation, I think, was that he would go to Alabama and have this incredible breakout. And obviously, the transfer is very controversial. Georgia, Alabama is a big deal. I should know more since I'm talking about him about the rationale for his transfer.
I want to say, as you're looking that up, I want to say the reason why he transferred is after Georgia, I want to say he had, I think, like an off-field issue, and then he had like a spat with, I want to say,
a fan at Tennessee.
Yeah.
But that was at Alabama. So
okay.
I did research that one. So he transferred before that. Again, well, I'll figure out a little more about why he transferred. So at Alabama, Tennessee beat Alabama at Tennessee when they last year with Hendon Hooker, and when Jalen Hyatt went crazy. It was that game. And I saw the clip. Okay. Tennessee fans rushed the field. Jermaine Burton was walking off the field, surrounded by people. There's like a bunch of women and a bunch of like cheerleaders all around him. And he like goes like this with his hand and like knocks one of the cheerleaders on the head. And then she didn't even react to it. She just kept cheering. Like it was like she was literally walking. He's walking this way to try to get off the field. The field is getting rushed. She was walking this way across him, and he like moved his hand. He didn't punch her. Like he moved his hand like this. Saban talked about it afterwards. People like made a big thing about it. I'm not saying it's nothing. I'm not saying it was a good choice for him to do. But I'm also saying when you're an athlete and you just lost a game like that and the field is getting rushed, like this wasn't. If you look up Jermaine Burton woman, you'll see like Jermaine Burton hit a woman. Jermaine Burton didn't do what Joe Mixon did or what Tyreek Hill did, or right. Like this is not, I want to be clear that it is on video. Like you can find the clip and watch it for yourself and make your own judgment. I am not defending it. I am classifying it in seriousness because he gets an off the field problems rep for that, which could actually make him a bit of a sleeper in the draft to me. Is part of the reason I have him here is because there's a profile of guys that slip for sort of that general character question. And if that becomes a thing for him, he could slip. And I'm not sure it's real. I'm not saying it isn't real. I'm not saying he doesn't have, I don't know him. I'm just saying, ask the question about that one. His last 2 years at Alabama were underwhelming compared to what people were expecting from the level of prospect that he was. But there is room for me. There is room to be interested for me. And the reason I'm choosing him is because he is one of these incredibly highly recruited players who, when you read his high school recruiting reports, he was being projected into the second round of the NFL draft as a high school senior going into a college freshman, which doesn't happen very often. It does not guarantee success, but it is one of those things you look for where you're like, when you think about some of these sleepers that have fallen to day 3, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Stephon Diggs, those are when you read their high school, like Jermaine Burton's profile looks like that. They comped him to Jarvis Landry at the time, 247 did. I'm not saying that's accurate. I am not I'm just saying you're dealing with a guy who is a very good talent. And this past year, he actually had a really good year. He had one of the best graded years, according to PFF, as a receiver in the country. He was a top 30 wide receiver in the country, according to PFF. It was a weird year for Alabama at quarterback. And I think, we talked a little bit about Jalen Milroe and the way he would progress through reads. Burton was more of a diverse kind of guy. Like he's a deep threat, so he's definitely a deep threat. He's never had an average yards per catch below 15 in his 4 years. So he's a deep threat guy for sure. But this past year, he became even more so. He had a 20.5 average yards per catch and 22 ADOT, which is insane. We talked a lot about Milroe looking to throw deep a lot. When you look at his tape, he's a really good separator. He runs some really nice crisp routes. There is evidence on tape of him taking sort of broken screen plays, breaking tackles, and getting into the end zone. You can see the electric level recruit he was in his, I can see it and it's not fully put together, but I can see it there in the tape. And I look at it and it's like, he's never had a horrible year. He just never it just never all came together for a breakout. And that archetype of a profile from a highly recruited athlete at high level programs speaks to me of somebody who could be a breakout, who's overshadowed by other highly recruited teammates at big time program. Like those are the types of guys that have a chance to go to the NFL and succeed. And again, those freshman markers matter. And he's shown a lot of improvement. So I'm interested. I'm very interested in Jermaine Burton. I'm interested to see where he goes. I don't know where exactly in the draft he's going to go. I think Mock Draft Database has him right now somewhere in like the 4th round, I want to say, which isn't actually, that isn't actually that low. We'll see if he actually goes. Does he go up from there? Does he go down from there? We'll have to see about that. But he's a guy I'm interested in.
When you were talking about him and describing him, the player that came to mind, I don't even know if this is even a right comp, but it just popped into my head as you were talking about it. Because Jermaine Burton isn't a guy that I've looked at, to be perfectly honest, just because, yeah, I have been burned by him. I have a couple of Devy shares of him.
Yeah.
So he's someone that I've purposely avoided. But when you were describing him, he kind of sounds like a Chris Godwin type.
Yeah.
And then when you look at him, he's 6 foot, 194 pounds.
Yep.
It's kind of like Chris Godwin as well. And then to kind of further that point, when we were talking pre-show about him, he always in big games, he always finds a way to make a big play.
He shows up. Yep. He shows up.
So that is a little interesting.
He has gone. So on October 22nd, he was ranked. He was on Mock Draft Database. He was an undrafted free agent. Today, his overall rank, he's projected to the 3rd round at pick 68. The risers like that are interesting. Like those risers are really interesting to me. Like and it's been a steady rise. Like he went up 1026, he went up to 200 from 337. Then 11-19, he goes up to 150 in his average. Then a month later, he goes up. Like the NFL is noticing, because that's how the mock drafts are. People who they're not perfect at all, and they're sometimes off by a round or two. Sometimes third round projected guys go in the fourth. Da, 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 da. But like, look at last year, right? Like Puka and Michael Wilson share something in common. They were both 4-star top 300 recruits who didn't get their production together in college, who ended up being Michael Wilson got himself into day 2 at the Senior Bowl. And then Puka got drafted in the 5th round, obviously. Both of them were not year 1 zeros. Like, they both produced from freshman year and had this kind of wonky, unclear, like wonky, never totally putting it together production. I'm not saying Michael Wilson, but for like Michael Wilson is an interesting, at least, NFL receiver. And again, it's a type of profile where you're like, okay, this is the type of guy. When these guys start to fall into the 3rd round, the 4th round, that were these really highly ranked, like, you got to take a look, and it's worth a dart. Like, it's worth a dart at it, because there are enough markers there that suggest this guy could actually be successful when you're trying to play that ceiling floor game with all these guys. And my objective is not to be like, I'm going to find the one guy and flag plant my guy and then do a bunch of receipt playing. That is not what I am archetyping here. Like, this is how I'm approaching the project.
So
That's my
who are
guy.
your 2 wild cards that you have?
Yeah, so my wild cards, I have so many wild cards this year. It's so hard to pick 2. Jacob Cowing is one of them. I really like Jacob Cowing's game a lot. He was elite at UTEP. Like, he produced right from being a freshman, and then was elite as a sophomore, junior at UTEP before transferring to Arizona. And he's had 2 very productive years at Arizona. Seems like a really good separator. Can actually is pretty versatile. He's really small. Like, he came in at the Senior Bowl as 5'8", I think, under 160, almost like 2-2 size. Again, doesn't mean he can't be successful. He's interesting because he was a guy I really considered in those last 2 spots of my top 10, because I think he could have a really good Senior Bowl as well. I think he's a really good route runner. I think the one-on-ones, he's gonna put dudes in a blender. Like, I think he's just like, you watch him and he can do it after the catch a little bit too. He can make guys miss. Again, it's the size and where does he go is why I kind of list him as a wild card. But he's a really interesting guy, and I like Jacob Cowing a lot, and I'll probably end up with a lot of shares of him in the sort of 2nd, 3rd round. He's one where landing spot will matter a bunch to me, especially with the size coming in. I'm not out on him at all. It just raises some questions that he's that much smaller. Like, he's a full 1.5 inches and 40 pounds smaller than Anaya Smith, for context. That is nothing. So that moved him to wild card for me a little bit, maybe overreactively, just saying. And then I put the Washington duo of Jalen McMillan and Jalen Polk, who were also 2 guys I considered heavily and had a hard time not putting in these 9-10 spots, because I actually really like both of them. One of my things with Rome is people talk about this year for Rome, putting him in this, that's why you can't say he's not the wide receiver 3. If Jalen McMillan didn't get injured this year, I don't know that Rome would have had a great year. It wouldn't have been as great, and it wouldn't have been so great that it was, because Jalen McMillan, if you look at the first 3-4 games, I believe, when Jalen McMillan was fully healthy, and Jalen Polk and Rome Odunze were fully healthy, they were almost identical in production. Like, almost identical. I mean, Jalen McMillan was balling, and Jalen Polk was balling. All 3 of them had like 200-yard games, I think, and one just under, and they kind of fluctuated depending on the game. And my question with this is, again, how will they all have different skill sets too. So McMillan was the one I was most interested in pre-draft process, and it was very hard for, like, all the way back to as a Devy and C2C prospect this year. So it was very hard for me not to have him in there. And I think he very well may end up in there. He's a former very high recruit, 4-star, played mostly in the slot, really nice route runner. I think he could be really sneaky. So I have him there. Again, I want to see where he lands and what kind of draft capital he ends up getting. And there's a lot of variables up in the air, which is why I have him listed as a wild card. And the same with Polk. Polk, not as high of a recruit, transferred from Texas Tech. He did have early success as a freshman. McMillan didn't as a freshman, but again, it was like he and Adunze both were in the it was the shortened Pac-12 season. So whether it matters or not is no question. He almost replicated. He and Rome were almost identical in production last year, and again, he was injured this year, so I don't know. And Polk took a leap, especially when McMillan went out. Polk took another leap, and Polk put some really nice stuff on tape. As really, really nice stuff. He's 6'2". He's big. He's 6'2". I think McMillan will end up 6 feet, 190 slot separator, but the type of guy that could just be a target. Like McMillan could come out of nowhere and be a target hawk. I could, in the right offense that schemes him right, he really is fluid. Like he's a very sophisticated route runner, goes in and out. I love him. I love him as a player. So, and Polk as well has deep ball skills. He's got some yak ability. He's 6'2", 200, big guy. Got speed. Got some speed. Has made some crazy catches and also had some games where he not only straight disappeared, but had massive drop, multiple massive drops where it was like, what's going on with you? I don't it was like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde kind of thing. Those two guys, again, I put that as that's wild card because I want to see how this Washington wide receiver class gets remembered. Is it going to be 3 elite guys, or is it going to be that was an awesome college offense that had these 3 guys that fit the system at the time and maybe one of them I just will be interested to see that. Those 2 guys were very hard to keep out. And again, if I'm talking about tiering, I'm willing to make all of these tier moves. This is all I'm talking all one big tier. I'll put Roman Wilson in this tier too. I have some questions about him. But I love Wilson's game. I'm scared off of Michigan receivers of that archetype translating to the NFL. But he's got a lot of really good stuff on tape and a good prospect history. So it's just a bunch of guys here that I'm willing to tier around, and I want to see these more. I want to see the Senior Bowl. I want to see how they do. I want to see how these things go when I think about predicting them.
I think rightly or wrongly, I think the Washington offense gets labeled as gimmicky because they're in the Pacific Northwest. But if it was done in the SEC, it would be a modern day offense, a modern day system.
Yeah, and we're going to see it this year.
And so I think with the trio of Washington receivers, if they were at Alabama this year, they would be comped to the Devontae Smith group with Jameson Williams and all of that. So I do think that is tricky about gauging that. Of the 3 baking in cost, I'll probably take Polk at cost. That's just because of cost.
I might take.
I don't know.
I think McMillan might be cheaper than Polk when all is said and done. And if he is, I'm gonna take him because it took him getting injured for Polk to break out. Polk didn't ascend him in the depth chart until he got injured. So that's where it's if I can get McMillan for cheaper than Polk, and I'm picking one of the 3 at cost, I'm going to go McMillan. But I could also go Polk at cost because he's got a lot of these traits that I really like. I love these guys as a receiver. I cannot stress that enough. And again, keeping that on my top 10, I'm happy to look back and be roasted to death about this. It's a fun exercise in an unknown time. The point is not to stake a claim, and my ego is not on the line with it. I love it. I agree with your take. It is a modern this gimmicky offense stuff we're starting to see in the NFL. Offenses change, open up more and more. I think we will lose that narrative. So that's where it's I'm not going to significantly lower Troy Franklin, Rome Odunze, or McMillan or Polk. They are not being lowered because I think their offense was gimmicky. That is not the reason they're being lowered. I don't think that was. I think these are modern offenses, and I just want to see how it translates. Now, those receivers might get into a non-modern offense in the NFL, if some team hires Arthur Smith again, in which case that's it, right? That's the whole. But if they get into a modern offense, they have these skill sets that are super interesting. So I agree with that heavily.
Now, who is your dark horse receiver?
All right, so for dark horse, again, very challenging exercise. I'm gonna go with Ricky Pearsall from Florida. So Ricky Pearsall, Senior Bowl came in with their tape measures and their scales, and they told us that Ricky Pearsall is basically the same size as Xavier Legette. Holy cow! This was not expected. Like Legette's got 10 or 15 pounds on him. Other than like they're the same height exactly. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I like Ricky Pearsall a lot. Like I love that dude's game. He started at Arizona State, transferred to Florida this year. Has never been the benefactor of being in one of these modern offenses. Like has never gotten that. Has never gotten that opportunity. Arizona State and Florida have been over the last few years known for not having that type of offense. Billy Napier is running not a lot. I mean, it's a different. He hasn't had the benefit of that. That dude is really refined with his routes. He has incredible wiggle and separation. Some of his contested catches, I'm like, like he has some catches on tape that are, dude. I'm like, this is a different level kind of beast. He is going to be at the Senior Bowl. I think he's fast. He runs by guys. He's a really good athlete, and he's put up pretty solid numbers. Again, not elite spectacular numbers, but very solid numbers. I know we're both big sort of Eugene Wilson fans, and in following Eugene Wilson, like Ricky Pearsall kept coming up as a great like impactor for him as a player, and to have in the wide receiver room as a freshman and a guy he was actively learning from. But also he just shows up on the tape, and he almost had he was 45 yards short of 1,000-yard season in the SEC with Graham Mertz throwing him the ball this year. Like he definitely produced this year. Slow start 2019, 2020, lower level recruit who developed later. I'm okay with that. This is a dark horse conversation. So I wanted to pick like an actual dark horse who doesn't have some of those markers that I think make them more interesting, but are like this guy. I think it's a gut thing. And he talk about a guy who like makes big catches. Like he really makes big catches. And he runs the ball also. Like he has had in his career, he's had 21 carries for over 200 yards over the course of his sort of 5-year career. Not like a ton, but he runs it. He had 8 for 113 last year on the ground. Like it's like you gotta like they get him the ball, and he's an interesting dynamic guy to keep an eye on. Be watching him at the Senior Bowl, and go find some Ricky Pearsall tape. Like this dude is so fun. Like wow, he is fun to watch to me.
Yeah, that was a great list of 10 receivers and then a couple of wild cards and a couple of dark horses. And as we transition from that, I do want to give you guys some player profiles of the day here. As we go through with each episode, we're going to give you a Devy profile of the day, a CFF profile, and an under the radar freshman profile of the day. The first player that I want to talk about is the Devy Digest player profile of the day, and that's going to be Florida State tight end Jaheim Bell. He measured in at 6'1", 229 pounds, and he is someone that is a pure athlete. He is a chess piece at the next level. He was used as a runner, schemed up for short area touches. He can also win intermediate routes as well. He's a very explosive athlete. He's a creator with the ball in his hands. He kind of reminds me of Delaney Walker. Now, there are a couple of things that I do have some questions about at the next level. He's not a true inline blocking tight end, so he is a landing spot dependent player. Now, I would say he'll probably go probably towards the end of the second round, probably third round of your rookie drafts. So he's someone that you should be looking at if you hold a late second to an early third. Now, the CFF player of the day that I want to talk about is also a tight end. It is Dan Villari for Syracuse. He is 6'4", 235 pounds, a former quarterback, used to be at Michigan. Now, he was used in all aspects last year. When Oronde Gadsden went down, Syracuse needed playmakers. He became one of that focal point. He was used as a power runner. He was a key in the receiving game. So he showed that he can do it all. He had 20 receptions for 180 yards and 3 touchdowns last year to go along with 55 rushes, 326 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Now, there is a new coaching staff there. They hired Fran Brown, previously from Georgia. He comes in. The offensive coordinator is Jeff Nixon. He has worked with Matt Rule in multiple stints, and most recently, he was the running backs coach at the Giants. Now, Villari could be a key puzzle piece for this young group because the receivers aren't exactly experienced. So Villari might get more look as a runner to complement LaQuint Allen. And then finally, the under the radar freshman profile of the day. This is going to be a real dark horse kind of a guy, but this is a guy that I really like. He is a wide receiver, Vosky Howard. He is going to Louisiana. He is 5'10", 175 pounds, a 3-star in the composites, as high as wide receiver number 80, and as low as being unranked in the composites. He averages out to be wide receiver 196. He's my wide receiver 40 of the 2024 class. Now, he is a slot receiver. He is really good at creating after the catch, really good yak ability. He is a physical receiver. He has football speed. His tape is full of him running away from defenders. He lines up in the backfield. They do some push screens with him, and he has a pathway of playing time. The receiving room at Louisiana is full of guys who are 6'2", 6'3", 6'1". No one really stood out this past season. Their most explosive guy was wide receiver Peter LeBlanc. He is out of eligibility. Vosky Howard brings immediate juice to the room, and he's someone that can earn a role as a returner, and with no standout there, can gain some reps as a slot guy. So those are our 3 player profiles of the day. Now, Noah, last time we talked to you, we asked what you were currently working on. You just released most recently a Devy Degens episode, right?
I did. Check it out on the links are on Twitter, and it's also if you go on to Dynasty Degens on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube. You'll find all the Devy Degens episodes. This past week, I had Katie Flower, who's one of the original. She was the original diva of Devy. It started doing Devy in like 2015, 2016. With like Scott Fish, Reggie Q, like when there was like nobody was doing this format, and we're seeing it grow now. And Felix, all the Campus Canton guys, like all of that. It was super cool to talk to her and just hear how it was like, just how did you do this back in like 2015 with no, like, she's like, yeah, we had nothing. It was like, I went on vibes. Like, it was like, I like players. Like, who was the first player who's a player you remember liking from like way early in Devy before they were the year before eligibility? And she was like, it was AJ Brown. Like, I loved AJ Brown. Told some great, so really cool episode. Give it a listen. She is unfortunately retired from content now, but I'm always thankful when people come out of retirement to share their knowledge. And she was really fun. This week on Monday, I'm going to have Colin Decker on Devy Degens, so you should check that out. And Andy, you're going to be coming on in the next couple of weeks also. We're going to do an episode over there talking about supplemental draft strategy, as we are doing this freshman mock right now, like you said, and getting our stuff together. So I'm really excited to put that episode together. And we've got really cool content coming out on that show in the next coming weeks. So I'm focused on working on that, and I will probably expand to do some other things as well. And I'm always putting out ideas, takes on Twitter at Noah_FF_green. So check it out. Engage. I love talking ball with everyone, and Andy, always such a pleasure to be on with you, man. I could literally just talk ball with you for like the rest of the day. It'd be easy.
I appreciate you coming aboard today and joining in and giving us your top 10 wide receivers, a couple wild cards, and a dark horse. And like Noah said earlier, go follow Noah at Noah underscore FF underscore green. Now, we'll be back next time, but before we go, if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button, comment, subscribe, and you can follow me at Andy underscore Pham1. And if you're listening on Spotify and Apple, give us a rate and review. We'll see you next time on the Devy Digest.